Western Letter on Antiquities, Lancaster, Ohio, 1841. Messer, Abel, and Co. Some of the Indian tribes of North and South America have traditions respecting the early settlement of this country by pure white people. This would intimate immigration from the northern part of Europe through Great Britain rather than that by Bering Straits from Western Asia. Now, again, we have to just completely destroy these ideas because we were dealing with an incredibly advanced seafaring race. Um, and the idea that these people just walked for 20, 30 years, 40 years across the Bering Strait is ridiculous. And the journey alone, you would face, at least a full season, and you wouldn't make it. And this correlates again to not long ago in the historical record, Alaska was a tropical place. So how can we even stick with these ideas of nomadic tribes wandering? Even the idea of some of these nomadic tribes that ventured from the northern latitudes into, the Mississippi Valley, so on and so forth. These people were openly trading with one another. So to say that they were, you know, cavemen or whatever, these kind of ideas that we have, um, those ideas are just ridiculous. And that the deeper down we go into the earth, we find far more advanced people, construction, kind of ideas of religion, and the not only that, but the animals and the people get bigger and bigger the deeper you go. But yeah, so you just gotta have to listen to people formulate these ideas because that was the norm back then, but we know better now. Like that of the Indians themselves, while okay, I already said that, and long been noted for whiteness of skin and just long, fair, silken hair, as is discovered on American mummies. Now, another thing to know, we talked about different phenotypes living in the same area. We had dwarfs and pygmies and giants living in the same area in Kentucky and Tennessee, all within a mile of each other. So, and they buried them. They had different burial ideas. This correlates with the Emperor Tigrinus video I did in New Mexico, where they found what they believe to be the oldest redheaded mummy ever found, and he was found 3 levels down. I don't mean like 3 stories in one building. I mean like 3 different layers of civilization. One had come in and built, and then another, and then some event happened. They were buried and wiped out, and then another group came in and built something, and they were wiped out. He was found at the bottom layer of this 3 layers of civilization, and there were 2, if not 3, different phenotypes living in um, this city or whatever you want to call it, group of people, and that you had the tall, redheaded, fair-skinned giant who was made king because he killed all the animals that were eating this pygmy race. These people weren't even 4 feet tall, and they had a completely more Asiatic type of burial, whereas this redheaded warrior had a completely separate type of burial religious ceremony, and that they were cooperating, living together, but obviously had different kind of funerary customs. And this has been found all over the Americas, from Alaska now to the Mississippi Valley. So we're dealing with different religions, different people, different sizes, shapes, skin colors, everything. We have mummies that are black haired with curls in Arizona and Utah. We have redheaded mummies in Arizona and Utah, fair skinned. So the mummies come in all shapes and sizes. Um, but yeah, they go all the way up to 10 feet in height, and you don't really find too many below 6 feet. When you get into the more dwarf pygmy size, they burned their bodies and they put them in funerary urns. So they were rarely ever found in whole skeletons. Very interesting stuff. The Indians universally disclaim our ancient works and monuments, which we attribute to the Aborigines, and allege that these works were erected by white people. Now, these stories exist all around. Quote Aborigines or Native Americans. All of them have stories of a race that was here antecedent to them and built all kinds of crazy shit, and that they found mummies all the time, and they knew a lot of these cultures traveled in these cave systems. I mean, just look at some of these Civil War stories where they talk about, the Apaches and all these other tribes that could disappear into the caves and then they'd be 100 miles away. They were aware of these, and they were aware that in these cave systems, especially in California and Utah, where these stories are still kind of kept alive today because you have an old enough history, Hopi, Apache. Some of these tribes are still living on these lands they've been on for 200 plus years, and then they have the historical records handed down from generation to generation, talking about not only red-headed giants, but um, incredible burial chambers inside these cave systems. And they held these cave systems sacred because that was their way of escaping, when they were being persecuted and chased. And some of these cave systems, they said you could go underground in Utah and come out in Mexico. And I don't doubt that for a second. We've talked about hundreds and hundreds of miles of cave systems that you can go in and spend a weekend and never see the sun. Mr. Thomas Bodley was informed by Indians of different tribes northeast of the Ohio that they had understood from their old men that it had been a tradition among their several nations that Kentucky had been settled by whites and that they had been exterminated in war. They were of the opinion that the old fortifications now to be seen in Kentucky and Ohio were the productions of those white inhabitants. Now, whether or not they're white or whatever, again, skin color had a completely was irrelevant in this time frame. And the big thing that I wanted to read this prior to that fortification episode is that they're saying the same thing, that whether or not they really know for sure that a quote white race built these giant star forts and fortifications is irrelevant. Um, I mean, it's not irrelevant, but whether or not they were white or not, I don't really. That means nothing to me. It's just showing again that they even said that these forts were antecedent to them, and probably even perhaps if they were directly related to the mound builders, I'd go even farther back and say that they were before. Remember, many of these mounds were actually buildings, and these people were just burying their kings and queens on top of these buildings. This is kind of the story with Easter Island. Easter Island was this huge structure, huge subterranean tunnels that are super ancient, and that they just found bodies like on the top of these giant cyclopean um, um, edifices, and that they are fairly certain that the bodies buried on top of these structures, they had nothing to do with building these structures. They just came upon this and were thought these were gods or built by gods, and that their chiefs and higher ups, kings and queens, would be buried on top of this, where the gods, constructed these types of edifices. And I think this is a similar story. Um, of course, there are burial mounds that were built by Native Americans or Aboriginals, or again, however you choose to label them, but they were built on top of a if it was a burial, it was a burial from a previous age, and more than likely, it was actually a constructed pyramid or building of some kind that had been covered in a deluge or some kind of cataclysmic event. Wapakoneta, Wapakoneta, or Shawnee Chief, when near 120 years old and living on the Al Anglesey River, confirmed the above tradition. An old Indian in conversation with Colonel James F. Moore of Kentucky informed him that the western country, and particularly Kentucky, had once been inhabited by white people, but that they were exterminated by the Indians, and that the last battle was fought in the Falls of Ohio, and the Indians succeeded in driving the Aborigines into a small island below the rapids. Now, how funny is that? Again, this is from the 1840, and that they're talking. This is from 1840. They're talking to a chief who's 120. So think about that. He's 120. So that's 1720, and he's saying that in his words, the Aborigines of Kentucky were white. So he's saying we fought and killed the Aborigines, and that they were white. Now, whether or not whatever you make of the story is irrelevant, but it's completely flipped inversion of what we're being told today. And again, I don't necessarily think there were all these warring tribes. I think there were a confederation of people. Whenever you have a huge trade conglomerate or empire, which the Mississippi was, you had all phenotypes living together, kind of like the Atlantis story, that you had people from all around the world living in one city. Last battle of Falls of Ohio, and they succeeded in driving the Aborigines into a small island below the rapids, where the whole of them were cut to pieces. He had said it was undoubted fact handed down by tradition, and that the colonel would have ocular proof when the waters of the Ohio became low. This was found to be correct upon examination. Examining Sandy Island when the waters of the river had fallen as a multitude of human bones were discovered. The same Indian expressed his astonishment that white people could live in a country once the scene of blood. The Indian chief called Tobacco told General Clark of Louisville that the Battle of Sandy Island decided finally the fall of Kentucky with its ancient inhabitants. General Clark says that Kentucky, in the language of the Indians, signifies the river of blood. In addition to the proof of a great battle near the Falls of Ohio, it is said that there was at Clarksville a great burying ground 200 or 300 yards in length. This is likewise confirmed by Major John Harrison, who received the tradition from an Indian woman of great age. Colonel Joseph Davies, when at St. Louis in 1800, saw the remains of an ancient tribe of Sacs to express some astonishment that any person should live in Kentucky. They said the country had been the scene of much blood and was filled with the manes of its butchered inhabitants. He stated also that the people who inhabited this country were whites and possessed such arts as are unknown to the Indians. Colonel McKee, who commanded on the Kanawha when Comstock was inhumanely murdered, had frequently conversed with the chief respecting the people who had constructed the ancient forts. Amanda Meow, I love your channel. I read in a local history book from my town that the natives here in Texas used the caves to help the slaves escape. A bit of a twist. Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Underground Railroad was absolutely connected with a lot of these subterranean tunnels. 100%. And there's been people that have done videos on this before, and that a lot of these the Underground Railroads are parts of buildings even that go 4 or 5 stories down. So what's Micmac saying? People of the Dawn, Wabanaki Confederation. Yep. Yeah. Pretty crazy. I mean, they're getting testimonies from people that are over 100 years old, and this is in 1840. Where was I? Yeah, they possessed arts that the Indians did not know. Colonel McKee inquired why the Indians had not learned these arts of the white people. He replied indefinitely, retaining that the Great Spirit had once given the Indians a book which taught them all these arts, and that they had lost it and had never since regained a knowledge of them. That's really interesting. I've heard a story like this before, that God gave them a book that had all this technology, and it's had some pretty interesting biblical overlays. Colonel McKee inquired particularly whether he knew what people it was who made so many mounds in the Ohio and northern places. He declared that he did not know and remarked that they were not made by his nation or any he had been acquainted with. Colonel McKee then asked him if he could tell who made these old forts. So again, you have this colonel, okay, in 1840 saying, who built these? And remember, the narrative that we're told now is that they were all built during the Civil War, but here you have a colonel who's going, who built these? He answered that he did not know. Last said that a story had been handed down from a very long ago people, that there had been a nation of white people inhabiting the country who made the mounds and forts. He also said that some Indians who had traveled very far west or northwest had found a nation of people who lived as Indians generally do, although of a different complexion. So yeah, 1844, silken hair mummies. Just a lot of really good gems in that article there. Kind of showing you they're talking to people that are 120 in 1840 who are giving you a history that is far from absent in our current recollection of things.